What's up guys, Dutogiraikonoka here, and welcome to as I'm going to be calling it, Jundam deck primer. It is a tempo dragon priest, which has become pretty powerful ever since week 4 of Blackrock. Quick disclaimer about this deck. This is not my deck. I did not make this deck. All credit for this deck goes to Tom Isn't Here. You can see his name at the top. This is not my deck. I have helped him modify the deck a bit. That is why I am doing this primer. I like this deck. I want to see it succeed. But, again, this is not my deck. This is his. Anyway, now that that's said, let's go first of all and get one thing out of the way, because it's a very common question. Tom did not name this deck Jundam Out. In fact, that is something that I have been calling it. And often I get asked why. For those of you who play Magic the Gathering, you might get it, but the phrase Jundam Out comes from Magic the Gathering back with the release of the Shards of Alara block. Back almost, what, 6 years ago? Maybe more than that. One of the shards was Jund. It was a shard that contained the 3 mana colors red, green, and black. For those of you who don't play Magic, what that basically means is that this is going to be just a powerhouse shard. Shards aren't a common thing in Magic, but that's what happened with this Shards of Alara block. That's why, in fact, they're called shards, is because they are the Shards of Alara in the lore. So the idea with Jund, as a shard itself, was, given its colors, it would just play these incredibly powerful minions and incredibly powerful spells, and it would win by just outpowering its opponent. It would win through tempo. That was what it did. It was just a tempo shard. And so what a Jund deck would do is just play a minion bigger than what any other deck could play, and either trade favorably or go face. And in Magic, trading works a lot differently than it does in Hearthstone, but we don't need to get into Magic mechanics. The point of the matter is that the Jund shard was basically tempo in its purest form. You just played hyper-powerful cards. You didn't do anything fancy. You didn't have any tricks up your sleeve. You just had raw power all over the place. And that was how you won. Raw power plus tempo. And it was pretty effective. On top of that, the creature that was like at the top of the food chain on the Jund shard were dragons. And so Jund and dragons went together like peanut butter and jelly in this block. So not only did you have a shard that was completely tempo-based, but it was tempo dragons. And that's exactly what this deck is. It is a dragon tempo deck that works in Priest. So that's why I call the deck Jundam Out. It is a throwback to Shards of Alara with Magic the Gathering because, well, Jund was a tempo dragon shard. It is the definition of tempo dragons, and in Magic the term Jundam Out is basically synonymous with out-tempo him. And so now that Hearthstone has a tempo dragons deck, it's like, well, Jundam Out. It works perfectly. So that's the name, for those of you who care. Now to get into the actual analysis of Tom's deck. The idea of the deck, as the name that I had given it and the name that Tom gave it, for that matter, would suggest is to out-tempo your opponent. You play minions that are vastly superior to your opponent's minions, and because you are a priest, you can trade favorably and just obtain board control through favorable trading and massive minions, or you can choose, just because you play bigger minions, to occasionally race your opponent, and there's nothing he can do about it because you have the better minions. It's almost guaranteed that your minions will be superior. How is this done? Well, the deck runs... Let's get into the Dragon Suite, at least. The deck runs Twilight Whelp. This is something that a lot of people have been trying to avoid. Twilight Whelp just seems like this really weird card. It's a potential zombie chow, as a 1-mana 2/1 with a battle cry of if you're holding a dragon, gain +2 health. But it has the potential to be worse than zombie chow. Because if you're not holding a dragon, it's a 1-mana 2/1, which is not playable in this kind of a tempo deck. Or so you would think. But given that this deck runs other cards with dragon text triggers, such as Blackwing Technician, Twilight Whelp is actually really good because it is a dragon itself, and so it can count as a trigger for those other cards. That makes it really, really valuable. And on top of that, sometimes it is just a 1-mana 2/3 without a drawback, because you're holding another dragon, in which case you just had an insane opener. So, Twilight Whelp is actually a really integral and really strong minion in the deck. It's capitalized on with minions like Blackwing Technician, which becomes a 3-mana 3/5 if you're holding a dragon, which is absolutely insane. In terms of stats, nothing beats that. This thing is literally changing the formats of the game, because the best 4-drop prior to Blackrock was Piloted Shredder. It's a 4-mana 4/3 that summons a random 2-drop when it dies. The thing with Blackwing Tech is if you play it and manage to trigger the dragon text on it, a 3-mana 3/5 can trade into the 4-mana Shredder and survive, and even if the Shredder pops something like a Succubus that's another 4-mana 4/3, if your opponent doesn't immediately deal with the Blackwing Technician, it'll go ahead and trade with the Succubus too. This thing will answer the most crazy 4-drop in the game prior to Blackrock, and the minion that it spawns. That's ridiculous. And all you gotta do is hold the dragon. I'm sold on it. So Blackwing Tech is one of those things that helps you really destroy your opponent. To capitalize on this strong opener, which is what is critical for a tempo deck, the deck runs Dark Cultist, another 3-drop, which is a 3-mana 3/4, one of the best 3-drops in the game, given its death rattle is to give a random friendly minion +3 health. It trades with Shredders, it'll buff up a different minion. It's just strong, and it's arguably, in the current state of the meta, the second best 3-drop, second only to Blackwing Technician. So you have the 2 best 3-drops in the game in this deck. That makes for insane openers, as well as one of the best 1-drops in the game. The deck also runs Wild Pyromancer, because Pyromancer can be useful as a 2-drop sometimes, just to out-tempo your opponent. Other times it's useful later into the game against such classes as Paladin, Warlock, and Hunter, which are all running around right now, where if you cast a spell it deals 1 damage to all minions and acts as a board clear. So you've got this really versatile kind of tempo plus board clear minion that is used in the deck. To capitalize on that, the deck runs Velen's Chosen. Velen's Chosen is useful because a lot of minions, even from the old meta carrying over, the target for minion health was 5 health. If a minion did not have 5 health, but had under 5 health, it was vulnerable to Piloted Shredder, which made it nearly unplayable. Well, what Velen's Chosen does is it takes a lot of your 3-attack creatures, like Blackwing Technician and Pyromancer, and it puts them up to that 5-attack mark, where you can trade with Sludge Belchers and other Blackwing Technicians, etc. And if you use something like Velen's Chosen on a Northshire Cleric or a Twilight Whelp on turn 2 because you coined it, your opponent is going to go home crying, because there is nothing he can do about that. His best answer is like an Ironbeak Owl, and a Northshire will still trade with that and survive. So it's a ridiculous tempo card, which is why it's also in the deck. The deck runs 2 Shadow Word Deaths because you're a priest, there's a lot of large minions, you might as well. It's a really good removal card. This makes... oh, my apologies. This makes the deck a little bit heavy on 3-drops, but that's okay because you're a tempo deck. The entire idea is to have a strong opener and then follow through with it. So if you have a really powerful turn 3, well, that's just fine. And if you go second, that means you likely have a really powerful turn 2 as well. And even if you go first, well, that's fine as well, because you could have Wild Pyromancer, you could have Power Word Shields to follow up, you could just have a ridiculous Twilight Whelp opener anyway. Stop, Mike. Sorry. And your opponent basically doesn't have a turn 2 anyway. And so your turn 2 doesn't matter, because your turn 1 destroys his turn 1 and turn 2. You can go ahead and just skip your turn 2 healing something, and then have a ridiculous turn 3. So that's the opener of the deck so far. To capitalize on this strong opener, the deck runs Hungry Dragons. This kind of makes sense because, given that you have such a strong opener, and especially a really strong turn 3, the battle cry of Hungry Dragon of summoning a random 1-cost minion for your opponent isn't that big of a drawback, because you're likely to have the minions necessary to trade with that 1-drop. And most of the time that 1-drop is a 2-1 or a 1-2, at worst. Occasionally your opponent will get a Dust Devil or a Flame Imp or something ridiculous like that, but those are very rare cases, and usually the fact that you have 2 3-attack 3-drops means that almost anything can be traded with, and you're fine. That means that because of your strong opener, you get to play a turn 4, 5, 6 without being punished. That's ridiculous. Now, actually, I'll get to that later. We'll talk about things that you can switch out later. So that's your turn 4. You've also got a Twilight Drake because it's a dragon, it's a 4-drop. Why not? You could have a large hand in time for this. Maybe. It's a good recovery method if you don't have a strong opener, right? So that's the Twilight Drake. When you get into turn 5, you run Azure Drakes because dragon and card draw, which is ridiculous put together. You run Sledge Belchers because it's the best taunt minion in the game. Still is, regardless of the changes. We haven't really seen any better taunt minions out of Blackrock, or for that matter, any taunt minions out of Blackrock. So you have to run Belchers still. And of course we run Holy Nova, and we run 2 of them because being a tempo deck, the fact that Holy Nova only deals 2 damage isn't that big of a drawback, and in reality, Holy Nova is more likely to deal 3 damage to your opponent's minions because you run Pyromancer, Velen's Chosen, and Azure Drake, which is 6 sources of spell damage, basically. And so deck types like Midrange Paladin, which will do the Quarter Muster combo, where you play Muster for battle and then you Quartermaster them and you get a bunch of 3/3s. Or Grim Patron Warrior, which summons a lot of 3/3s. That's fine, you've got spell damage. Throw a Holy Nova out, his whole board's gone. He can go home crying too. You're fine with it. For late game, because a tempo deck does need late game, otherwise it just becomes an aggro deck, we run Cabal Shadow Priests, because that's really strong against aggro, which is one of tempo deck's worst matchups. And we run Sylvanas because she's arguably the best 6-drop in the game to date. Yes, better than Emperor Tharazon. The deck also runs Dr. Boom because best 7-drop in the game, Chromagus because dragon, and really potent 8-drop, especially given that this deck runs Power Word Shields and Azure Drakes to synergize. It's just a big threat, and if your opponent lets it live for 1 or 2 turns, you basically win. It's like Kel'Thuzad, kind of, but it's a dragon. And then as a finisher, this deck runs Ysera. This means that this deck is really strong against control decks because a control deck against a mid-range deck is forced to blow a lot of its removal really early, just to stay alive. When you drop a Ysera on something like a Control Warrior after both Shield Slams and both Executes have already been used, he has nothing he can do about it, and Ysera just wins the game from there. So the whole kind of trifecta of Sylvanas into Boom into Chromagus into Ysera just makes this really, really potent late game to capitalize on your strong openers and strong mid game. It makes the deck just really strong from turn 3 to turn 9. And its turn 1 is still pretty frequently quite decent. And going second, its turn 2 is strong for that matter. That means that this deck, all in all, just has a strong curve throughout the game. The weakest turn for it is arguably turn 4, and that's not always even guaranteed, because if you hit your 4-drop, you're fine. If you play a 3-drop and a Power Word Shield, or a 3-drop and a Twilight Whelp, you're still fine for turn 4. And this deck has a lot of 3-drops and 1-drops. Put those together, you get its 4-drop. So it really just works nicely. Now that that's aside, though, given what we run in the deck and why, a lot of people are going to say, well, okay, I don't have this card or I don't have that card. What can I swap for them? One of the swaps that I'm kind of a fan of is swapping Hungry Dragon for Dragonkin Sorcerers. This means that assuming your opponent somehow has that miracle hand that answers everything that you play, your Hungry Dragon isn't going to bite you. You can still, or because it's not a Hungry Dragon, you have a 4-drop that you can play now as a Dragonkin Sorcerer that's still a dragon that doesn't have that many drawbacks. Combine that with the fact that you run Power Word Shield and Velen's Chosen, you get a 4-drop that has ridiculous buff potential for itself. You put a Velen's Chosen on a Dragonkin Sorcerer, you get a 6/10. Just under big game hunter range, but ridiculously powerful in and of itself. Or you put a Power Word Shield on it, it's a 4/8. Not even in death range, but still ridiculously powerful as a turn 5 play, or just even a capitalistic play after you've played a Dragonkin Sorcerer on turn 4. So Dragonkin Sorcerer is a decent replacement for Hungry Dragon. It's one I'm fiddling with right now, but I really do like the change. Honestly, I think it's preferential. Hungry Dragon, without needing buffs, can trade really well with Belchers and other 5 health minions, but at the same time, he's less useful if you kind of start to lose tempo in the early game. Whereas Dragonkin Sorcerer is just more consistent. It's not as much of a game winner when it sticks, and is played on curve, but it's still strong. So that's more of a preferential choice for people who play the deck. Another swap that people could kind of ask about is Twilight Drake. Personally, I don't actually like running one Twilight Drake in the deck. I think it's a recovery method for a really horrible situation where the deck is already just kind of losing. I think instead Twilight Drake would be better served being one of the big 4 tech cards. The big 4 are Kazan Mystic, a 4-mana 4/3 that takes an enemy secret, Harrison Jones, a 5-mana 5/4 that destroys your opponent's weapon and lets you draw cards equal to the weapon's durability, Lotheb, a 5-mana 5/5 that makes enemy spells cost 5 more next turn, and the Black Knight, a 6-mana 4/5 that will destroy target minion with Taunt. The Black Knight would be useful in a control meta, which is something that, Jundam is already really strong against, being a mid-range deck that just has massive minions. Harrison is good against, like, Dragadins when they're running Rampant. It's pretty good against Rogues, decent against Warriors. If you're seeing a lot of those kinds of decks, Harrison's a good minion to run. Kazan Mystic is absolutely ludicrous against a lot of other tempo decks. You talk about mid-range Hunter, they usually cannot handle having a Freezing Trap Kazan. It just loses the game for them. You talk about a Tempo Mage. They can't handle when you Kazan their Mirror Entity. They just lose. You talk about Freeze Mage, even. Kazan is really good against them. So if you see a lot of mages and a lot of hunters, things like that, Kazan is pretty good. The deck can still support itself in most control-y matchups, and it'll just do well. And then we get to Lotheb. Lotheb is just good against combo decks. If you're seeing a lot of combo Druid, if you're seeing a lot of Oil Rogue, and if you're seeing a lot of like Grim Patron Warrior, then Lotheb does really well against those kinds of decks, so he can be boarded in. Another thing you could do, if you prefer, is against the current Dragadin meta. You could board in a Lotheb over Twilight Drake, which really helps answer that turn 6 Yazera. Given that you have so many minions that you should consistently be able to play to the board earlier in the game, being able to play Vol'jin on turn 5 to swap health with a turn 6, or not on turn 5, on turn 6 or 7 to respond to like a turn 6 or 7 Yazera, is really powerful. Because you can just trade a minion away, you get rid of one of your opponent's win cons, and against matchups like Control Warrior and mid-range Demon Lock, Vol'jin is still really powerful because he gives you an answer to those large minions that the decks like to run that can force you to use deaths before you need to use them. So that's what you could swap for Twilight Drake. I like using Twilight Drake as a tech card, but you could also just use Twilight Drake, because he is still a 4-drop dragon, and he's still pretty powerful. I've heard some people have a few problems with running Dark Cultist. Personally, I think dropping Dark Cultist represents too much of a tempo loss and a shift toward control. If you want to play a control deck, that's fine, but that's not what this deck is for. I don't think this deck is built for that. You'd have to basically change the deck so much that it becomes a new deck if you wanted to play control. So I don't think Dark Cultist is a minion you can really drop. But that's my personal opinion. As to swaps for Cabal, I don't know. You could drop Cabal for like a Draconid Crusher if you wanted to. You could drop Cabal for another tech slot. But personally, I think Cabal is one of those cards that is just absolutely ludicrous against aggro decks, which is the natural counter for tempo and mid-range, which is what Jundam is. So if you drop the Cabal, you significantly worsen your matchups against a lot of aggro decks, which will naturally be your harder matchups. So I think the Cabal is pretty necessary for this deck, unless you're literally not seeing any aggro in the meta. If that's the case, hallelujah, we friggin' killed cancer. We cured it, boys. We did it. But I doubt it. Now to get to more of the important minions that people really want to know if you can replace. People talk about not having Sylvanas. What can I do to replace Sylvanas? One of the best cards I have found to replace Sylvanas is Faceless Manipulator. In most matchups, Faceless Manipulator does almost as much work as Sylvanas, and occasionally, there are even situations where Faceless is better than Sylvanas. The reason for this is, say your opponent plays a Sylvanas to the board. Usually as a priest, your answer is to play your own Sylvanas and death your Sylvanas so that you take theirs. It's like a mind control. You can still do that with Faceless. You Faceless their Sylvanas, you death the Faceless Sylvanas, and then you just take their Sylvanas. It works the same way. Or you want to talk about something like a Ysera. Your opponent plays a turn 6 Ysera, no problem, I'll just Faceless that Ysera. That's pretty powerful, and playing Sylvanas gives your opponent a turn to silence the Sylvanas or answer it, where playing Faceless doesn't. You just instantly copy the minion. And in most cases, using Faceless Death is actually like a targeted version of Sylvanas Death, which can be really useful against a lot of different classes, even against Paladin when they play Tyrion. One of the best counters to Tyrion for this mid-range deck is to try to clear your opponent's board. Your opponent is forced to play Tyrion before turn 10 when he can also tap afterward. You can play Sylvanas, you can death it, you take his Tyrion, he goes home crying because when a Paladin gets his Tyrion stolen, he loses. Well, if you have a Faceless, you can go ahead and just Faceless the Tyrion and death it, and sure, your opponent gets an Ashbringer, but he's still got a Tyrion to get through now with that Ashbringer, and he's going to give you an Ashbringer when he does it. So in a lot of cases, Faceless Manipulator is a good substitute for Sylvanas if you don't have Sylvanas. That being said, there are other situations where Sylvanas is superior to Faceless, but quite honestly, the two, in my experience playing Hearthstone, are pretty interchangeable, or at least Faceless is a functional replacement for Sylvanas in most situations. People talk about not having Dr. Boom. What do I do to replace Dr. Boom? I'm actually sorry here, guys. There isn't a replacement for Dr. Boom. I mean, he's a massive turn 7 tempo gain. And he is one of the best cards in the game right now. So if you don't have Dr. Boom, I don't think you can replace him. Sorry. Yeah. That's Dr. Boom. He's irreplaceable. What about Chromagus? Well, we're talking about a deck that was made after the release of Blackrock. If you have such things as Dragonkin Sorcerer, or even Hungry Dragon, you're going to have Chromagus too, because you cleared that far into the wing. If you don't have Blackrock done and you're trying to make a dragon deck, I don't know what you're doing. So Chromagus shouldn't be a minion you need to replace. What about Ysera? What can you replace Ysera with? Honestly, there isn't a great replacement for Ysera, given that she is just such a powerful late-game minion that wins games if she is left unanswered. That being said, you could still try to replace Ysera with something like Alexstrasza if you wanted to, just to set your opponent's health lower or to heal yourself in aggro matchups. I've had a lot of experience with Alex being a lifesaver in aggro matchups. You could probably get away replacing Ysera with some earlier dragon for more tempo, like, you know, a Dragonkin Sorcerer or a Twilight Drake, or something of that nature. Maybe you even want to replace Ysera with a Singleton Blackwing Corruptor, because tempo. But, I don't know. I don't like that change a ton. So yeah, what about Pyromancers? A lot of people would think, well, okay, this is a tempo deck, couldn't you find a better 2-drop? Maybe even Fairy Dragon, this is a dragon deck after all. Yeah, no, don't try that. I mean, I'll get into replacements for Pyro, but do not default to Fairy Dragon. Fairy Dragon is terrible in Priest. You cannot Power Word Shield it, you cannot heal it, you cannot Velen's Chosen it. It may be a dragon, but it is still one of the worst 2-drops in Priest. You would be better off running like a Bloodfen Raptor. Even with the dragon subtype, Fairy Dragon is worse than Raptor in this kind of a deck. Don't try it. Fairy Dragon sucks in Priest. Period. That being said, reasonable replacements for Pyromancer. If you wanted to, you could get away with replacing him with 2 Shrinkmeisters. Shrinkmeisters are absolutely amazing for tempo because they allow you to trade without losing health on your minions. They're like an instant heal plus play a 3-2, which is value in and of itself. On top of that, if your opponent wants to play something ridiculous like a turn 7 Ysera out of a Dragaddon, And I keep defaulting to this because Trump did it to me earlier today and I was really salty about it, but not important. You then have Shrinkmeister plus Cabal, and you can use that to take the Azera from the person who just tried to screw you over with his Dragon Consort. Not going to happen. So Shrinkmeister is still a really powerful tempo minion, even if you're not playing a Theft Priest deck archetype. So Pyromancer could be replaced with Shrinkmeister if you wanted to. And it would work pretty well. As for Azure Drakes and Sludge Belchers, I've heard arguments for Argus over Sludge Belcher. In this kind of a deck, I don't think you really want to be doing that. Part of the reason why Sludge Belcher is so good is that when your opponent plays a Sylvanas and tries to force you to trade with it, because he threatens to just get way too much value otherwise, you can Belcher, and your opponent's Sylvanas is stuck trying to get through a Belcher for 2 turns in a row, or at the very least for 1 turn, which gives you time to just kind of try to out-tempo your opponent and make that Sylvanas irrelevant. When you use Argus, all you're doing is buffing up the minions that he could take. Not as good. So, yeah. Those are my thoughts on the deck. Give me 2 seconds here. Okay, sorry for the interruption. I'll have edited it out for you guys, but still sorry for it. Anyway, so we just finished with talking about the deck and possible swaps for cards in the deck. That being said, let's go ahead and analyze the deck's matchup so you know when to play this deck. I made a spreadsheet for this deck, just as I did with Emperor Velen. It's a deck on my Hearthpwn channel. You guys can, or not channel, account, I guess. You guys can go ahead and check it out if you're interested. But yeah. What we see with this deck is that it is really good against warriors. Grim Patron Warrior or Control Warrior doesn't really matter. The reason for this is that against Control Warrior, you have a deck which is mid-range, and a faster mid-range deck at that. That is the natural counter to Control Warrior, is a faster mid-range deck. Because Control Warrior is forced to use removal earlier than it would like to for maximum value, and even when your opponent clears things with weapons, it's just more damage to his face, and you can out-tempo him easily. When it comes to Patron Warrior, this is a... Sorry, I keep having to sneeze. It keeps happening to me. Okay, I think it's gone. Okay. When it comes to Patron Warrior, you have a combo deck which is completely obliterated by spell damage Holy Novas and which combos off turn 8 and later. This means it's not uncommon to be able to recover with something like Azure Drake plus Holy Nova for 3 damage to the whole board, just wiping it. Patron Warriors don't like to see that. In terms of Shamans and Oil Rogues, I haven't seen very many of those. I would imagine Oil Rogue would not be happy about this deck. Oil Rogue is pretty weak to other mid-rangey decks. So, yeah. It just doesn't handle them that well. Guys. My mic had this spasm. It's been doing this thing lately where a little wire's loose and it'll make a bunch of noises. I'll have edited that out too. Sorry about that. Okay, so we come to Dragadan. When it comes to Dragadan, the Jundamount deck and the Dragadan deck will go fairly even in the matchup because they're very similar decks. They're mid-rangey tempo dragon decks that run some pretty powerful minions and abuse dragon text to win. I think, just from my experience against Dragadans and from the way the 2 classes work, Priest should have a slight edge in this case, because Priest 1 has the buff spell Velen's chosen to answer Aldor Peacekeeper, and to help trade with 3 attack minions up into 5 health minions. And on top of that, the Priest hero power means that Priest should get more value out of his dragon minions than the Paladin will get out of his. This isn't always the case, because the Dragadan deck has room to run such cards as Blackwing Corruptor, where the Jundamount deck does not. But on the other hand, you know, it's 50-50. Sometimes the Paladin has the cards he needs, sometimes the Priest has the cards he needs. But more often than not, the fact that Priest can milk more value out of his minions than the Paladin can means that Priest should win that matchup. I haven't seen any Control Warriors. Mid-range Warriors largely replaced by Dragadan at this point. We talk about Face Hunter. Face Hunter is a really fast aggro deck, and because of that, it is a natural counter to Jund Out, because it is just a faster deck. This said, the Jund Out deck still does roughly, it still wins about 50% of its games against Face Hunter, given that you run cards like Sludge Belcher, you can have insane openers, you have Pyromancer, and you're a Priest. Despite the fact that you're a mid-range deck, you're actually a lot more durable than any other mid-range deck is. And because of that, a lot of these really fast aggro decks don't do that well against you, because they just can't manage to kill the darn Priest. He doesn't die like the other mid-range decks do. And so the Face Hunter matchup, just by virtue of you being a Priest, comes out to actually be roughly 50-50. Sometimes he gets the damage he needs to kill you, sometimes your hero power just wrecks him. We talk about mid-range Hunter, the exact same thing happens. You have a dragon deck that runs minions that are largely superior to the minions that mid-range Hunter will be running, with the exception of Highmane being superior to Sylvanas and Cabal. But that really doesn't matter. You've got only one superior minion, and Priest is just too durable. Mid-range Hunter can't manage to kill you. In fact, he's usually on his back foot the whole time, because you have really strong openers. And you can outvalue him with your minions and take board control. We get into Combo Druid. Combo Druid's about 50-50. I mean, sometimes Combo Druid has the removal that he needs to beat Jund Out, and he keeps drawing the right cards. Given that Combo Druid has a lot of card draw, this actually happens more often than you would think. It's infuriating, but it happens. So, sometimes he draws what he needs to just keep removing your minions, and then he uses his superior late game and combo win-con to kill you in one turn, even though you're at like 28 health, and the dude's only managed to stick 2 minions and a Belcher. One of which is a Shade, the other one's an Ancient of Lore, which he protected with Cenarius, and then he drops a Belcher, and he's like, okay, you're not going to get through this, I'm just going to combo you next turn, and you're going to die, because Combo Druid's balanced. So that happens. With Ramp Druid, you just have a deck that's a little too late. It's a little too far to the control side of the spectrum to have a favorable matchup against Jund Out. Again, your superior minion quality and the fact that you can buff minions up to trade favorably just beats Ramp Druid. Sometimes Ramp Druid will be able to stick large minions to the board and you won't have any removal, you won't have large enough minions, you won't have buff spells, you just won't seem to get what you need to kill off these minions. And all he needs is to stick those big minions and not have them removed for, 2 or 3 turns, maybe. And then you've lost control of the board, you've lost your tempo, he's going to beat you from that point. It happens, but it's not much you can do about it. You talk about Zoo. Zoo falls into the exact same category as Face Hunter does. It's an aggro deck, it's faster, it should naturally win. But the problem is, you out-trade him, and you have a decent removal suite, and you're a Priest, you just don't die to anything. So Zoo struggles to try to take control of the... And by virtue of that fact, he loses. With Handlock, Handlock is just kind of slow, he never really manages to recover. As long as you play against Handlock the way you're supposed to avoid the Molten Giant Shadow Flame combo, you should be able to beat him without too much trouble. Mid-range Demon Lock. Yeah, mid-range Demon Lock is kind of favored against this deck. The problem against mid-range Demon Lock is that, at least when I play against them, and I've had like 20 games that I've recorded against them, they almost always seem to have Voidcaller plus Mal'Ganis. Every time a Voidcaller dies, Mal'Ganis comes out. And when you talk about playing a 4-mana 3/4, and when it dies it summons a 9/7 that makes your hero immune and buffs all your other demons, you just lose at that point. When it happens on like turn 5 or turn 6. You can't beat that kind of a thing. Unless you have Shadow Word Death immediately for that. And other times, on the rare occasions it doesn't happen, your opponent will play Boom first, you death it, then he plays Mal'Ganis. They want your death, you can't answer it, you lose. So mid-range Demon Lock is just really annoying because Mal'Ganis makes the enemy hero invulnerable, and he always manages to cheat it out or do something weird. So mid-range Demon Lock is kind of unfavorable, but I mean, you're a priest, the fact that you can't manage to punish him really for his card draw hero power and only have so much removal, he manages it every time. He ekes out that win. And it always feels like he just barely gets it, but he gets it. Mech Mage falls into much the same category as Zoo does, where your superior minion quality tends to beat the Mech Mage, coupled with the fact that you can heal your minions for superior value. And against Tempo and Flood Mage, the same thing happens. I haven't played against Freeze Mage, so I don't know how that matchup goes. But I would imagine it's actually not amazing, because Freeze Mage is super durable, has plenty of board removal, and can just combo you to death. But I don't know. I'm not practiced against Freeze Mage. I don't see a lot of them, so I don't really know all of Freeze Mage's counters and how to beat them. I don't know. I play it. I play against him when I see him. When it comes to Priest decks against Control Priest, by virtue of the fact that you're a mid-range deck, you should have a favorable matchup. Against other Dragon Priests, it's a toss-up. I mean, I think this is the best variant of a mid-range Dragon Priest, but I don't know that for certain. I wouldn't be making this video if I didn't think it were the truth, but I don't know it for certain. So all in all, I think Jundam is pretty strong in the current meta. Yeah, you've got a disfavorable matchup against mid-range Demon Lock, but honestly, I just think Dragon Priest is a strong archetype in general, because you naturally beat control decks by virtue of you being mid-rangey. As a priest, you've got your aggro matchups covered by your hero power, and against other mid-range decks, yeah, some of them are favorable, some of them are disfavorable. Maybe you can tech around with that. If you see a lot of mid-range and face hunters and stuff like that, tech in a Kazan Mystic over the Twilight Drake. You'll stomp them. So, yeah. Those are my thoughts on the deck. I know I was also asked if my microphone would just stop being the way it is. I was also asked if I could do a mulligan guide for this deck, on how I think you should mulligan. Personally, oh. Okay. Stop it. Mike, stop. What would I mulligan for? Against other priests, try to mulligan for, like, Twilight Whelps, Blackwing Techs, Dark Cultists, and depending on whether you're running Hungry Dragon or Dragonkin Sorcerer, that's a pretty good minion to mulligan for. Power Word Shields are alright, Northshires are alright. Honestly, in most matchups, just mulligan for your early game. Depending on what card you have teched in, say you have Harrison Jones teched in because you're seeing a lot of weapon decks like Oil Rogue, Dragadin, Control Warrior, and maybe a Hunter every here and there. Against matchups where you have a tech card teched in, you obviously want to keep that tech card because it is powerful. So that's something you want to bear in mind as well. In certain cases, say you have a hand where you just draw in 2 spells. This deck is not spell heavy, but it can still happen where you draw a hand with mostly spells. Say you have like Velen's Chosen, a Power Word Shield, and a Holy Nova or a Shadow Word Death or something. I wouldn't even keep the Velen's Chosen in that case because you don't guaranteed have an early game minion to put the Velen's Chosen on. That said, if I have a Northshire or a Twilight Whelp or a Wild Pyromancer in my start hand and I see Velen's Chosen, I'm not dropping that Velen's Chosen. That's a really good follow-through on early game pressure. The other interesting thing about the deck is that if you see a hand that has like Twilight Whelp and Blackwing Tech in it, and then you also see Ysera, I actually don't drop the Ysera in that case. Or Chromagus, or Azure Drake, or any of that. It's a dragon trigger for 2 cards with dragon text. If you see that your hand has a lot of dragon text in it, and you have a late game dragon in hand, I'd keep it just to trigger the text and get a lot of value. It's usually worth doing, surprisingly. So, yeah. Those are kind of the intricacies of the deck, and for the most part your mulligans don't change all that much. You don't keep any card that is 5+, with the exception of where I said trying to trigger Dragon Text. I usually wouldn't even keep 4 drops in an opening hand, again, unless it's a dragon and you can trigger Dragon Text with it. And yeah, I mean, mulliganing with this deck is rather simple. Try to get your early drops, and if you don't see minions in your start hand, don't keep buff spells. If you have a tech card for a certain matchup, keep the tech card. Assuming it is that matchup, of course. So, those are my thoughts on the deck. And that's the primer for this deck. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Tom did a really good job with this deck. And I apologize for the mic. It's had a little bit of wiring issues in my headset. And I know it's annoying. I know none of you want to hear random crackling, but I'll get it sorted. Don't worry about it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.